The OnePlus 6T is perhaps the company's most minor refresh ever in terms of hardware, with the two new biggest features being a new in-display fingerprint reader and a smaller notch. Even by the standards of OnePlus's previous product refresh timelines, the OnePlus 6 has had a very short life. Just 5 months after its launch, it's already out of stock and effectively dead. The biggest reason for the company to whip up a new model this soon could be its first ever partnership with a US carrier. We're intrigued by how this company is going to handle the removal of features, some of which it has championed in the past. We have a lot of questions and we're going to dig up all the answers. First of all, the chunky notch has been replaced with a slight water drop dip for the front camera. The biggest downside of this notch design is the death of the popular multicolor notification LED that's been a OnePlus staple till now. The loss is somewhat offset by the ambient display feature that lets the OLED screen light up to show notification information, but that isn't always on, so you can't tell at a glance if there are alerts for you to check. The screen is slightly larger than that of the OnePlus 6 at 6.41 inches compared to 6.2 inches before. If you place the two phones next to each other, you'll notice that the new model's bottom chin has also been reduced. The increase in screen size is entirely along the vertical axis, taking the resolution up from 1080 by 2280 to 1080 by 2340. Less of that area is now impinged upon by the notch, but you can still mask it with black bands on either side if you like. OnePlus will ship this phone with a pre-applied screen protector because it can't guarantee that aftermarket ones will allow the in-display fingerprint sensor to work. The screen is very bright and colors, especially reds, appear very saturated. This makes visuals pop a lot no matter what you're doing. In addition to the loss of the notification LED, there's no 3.5mm audio jack. This will be the most controversial feature given OnePlus's vocal defense of the analog standard and ribbing of its competitors in the recent past. There's a grill in its place for symmetry, but it isn't an actual speaker. This feels like a missed opportunity considering that most premium phones today can deliver decent stereo sound. Other than these things, the OnePlus 6T looks identical to the OnePlus 6. The pill-shaped bump for the dual rear cameras is exactly the same down to the slightly rough edges that we criticized last time. The power and volume buttons, alert slider and dual nano SIM tray are also unchanged and there's nothing wrong with them. The OnePlus 6T feels very well built. We had a mirror black review unit and it wasn't too slippery. This phone looks great other than the smudges it picks up. If you can keep it clean, it almost looks like it's at the level of Apple and Samsung's top-end products. Coming so soon after the launch of the OnePlus 6, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that there are no major changes to the specifications. We still have the same Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 processor running at up to 2.8 GHz. The base variant now has 128GB of storage with 6GB of RAM. The next step up gets you 8GB of RAM with no increase in storage, and the top-end variant has the same 8GB of RAM with 256GB of storage. Battery capacity is also up from 3300 mAh to 3700 mAh. That's always good, but it comes at the cost of a slight weight increase from 177 grams to 185 grams. There's Gorilla Glass 6 for physical protection, but OnePlus doesn't claim any dust or water resistance rating. There's also still no wireless charging, which is slightly disappointing. The OnePlus 6T will ship with Android 9 Pie underpinning OnePlus's Oxygen OS 9 UI. The security patch at the time of reviewing was the November 2018 release. OnePlus is very proud of the many customizations that go into Oxygen OS, including the 5 screen calibration modes, reading mode, gesture shortcuts, UI customization options, and performance tweaks. The improved game mode now allows incoming messages to appear unobtrusively so as not to disrupt games. As before, you can prioritize network bandwidth and system resources to make games run better while suppressing interruptions. There's also a new Smart Boost feature that keeps apps permanently in the phone's RAM so they load quicker than they would from storage. This is currently an early implementation and only works for games. General performance is pretty much what we'd expect from a flagship class phone with a Snapdragon 845 processor. Apps and games load very quickly and we never had any cause for complaint with day-to-day usage. The back of this phone did get fairly warm when charging quickly and when using the camera, but not enough for it to become uncomfortable to hold. We're sure everyone is most curious about the in-display fingerprint sensor, but in short, it's not as good as a standard one. You have to wake the OnePlus 6T to activate the sensor, you can't just touch it like you might be used to. Luckily, there are options to trigger the ambient display feature with a tap or when you pick the phone up, and you can use the sensor when the screen is active. Then you have to be conscious of where and how exactly you're placing your finger. OnePlus says it waited until this technology was ready, and now the response time is just 0.34 seconds. We can't measure that precisely, but we can tell you that there's almost always a noticeable pause when trying to use the sensor. In terms of functionality, it isn't necessarily an upgrade or improvement. There's still face recognition though, and it works quite well. The OnePlus 6T's performance in benchmarks was pretty much on par with that of the OnePlus 6 when the two phones were tested side by side under identical conditions. That's thanks to the lack of difference between their specifications. We played a bit of PUBG and Asphalt 9 Legends. There's more than enough power on tap here for both these heavy games. Both ran very smoothly, but once again the phone got a little warm. The game mode kicked in automatically for PUBG, but it didn't take much effort to add Asphalt to the list manually. We also spent a fair amount of time streaming HD video, which the OnePlus 6T handled effortlessly. Battery life is pretty strong. With a fair bit of gaming and around 2 hours of video streaming plus general use throughout the day, we were able to go from morning to night without dipping below 15%. Our HD video loop test ran for a very respectable 13 hours and 45 minutes. Dash Charge, or as it's now called Fast Charge, is still a tremendously valuable feature. In just 10 minutes we were able to get from 0 to 17%, and that went all the way to 65% in 40 minutes. There are no changes at all to the camera hardware. The primary rear camera is a 16 megapixel unit with an f1.7 aperture. You get optical and electronic image stabilization with it. The secondary 20 megapixel sensor is used only for depth sensing and to speed up autofocus. On the front there's a single 16 megapixel camera with an f2.0 aperture and electronic stabilization. OnePlus says that the camera software has been tweaked, but the most notable new feature called Night Mode is coming to the OnePlus 6 as well. In this mode, the camera takes up to 10 frames in 2 seconds and then combines them in order to pick out details and control noise. The processing is supposed to take just a couple of additional moments, but we found ourselves sometimes waiting for 8 to 10 seconds. Night Mode made very little actual difference to shots taken at night in various degrees of darkness. In some cases, distant objects were more distinct. In others, noise and grain were reduced, but it took a keen eye to spot the differences, and that too only at 100% on a big screen. Photo quality in the daytime was quite impressive. We were able to discern fine details on distant objects, and there was no trouble with parts of a frame being overexposed. The OnePlus 6T even did a decent job when we were shooting directly into the sun. HDR is set to automatic by default, but you can override this. There's barely any shutter lag and everything works smoothly. Colors were just a tiny bit muted, but the focus was always sharp and on point. Macros looked great and background blurring was smooth, effectively highlighting our subjects. In fact, we often prefer this to the effect created by the portrait mode, which is sometimes a bit too aggressive and artificial. Speaking of artificiality, edge detection wasn't always accurate and some portraits looked weird on the phone screen. They were perfectly fine later in the gallery app, which makes us think some additional post-processing happens slightly after you take shots. Photos taken at night in the standard mode were sometimes quite noisy and lacking in detail, and motion blur due to long exposures was a real problem. Our samples were very bright, which brought out a lot of detail, but several of them looked like very aggressive sharpening and noise reduction filters had been applied. With a steady hand and good ambient light, results were reasonably good. You get a fairly comprehensive Pro mode with a live histogram, bokeh shape filters, time-lapse mode, panorama mode, and slow motion video at up to 240 fps at 720p. Video recording goes up to 4K at 30 fps or 60 fps, though you're limited to 10 minutes or 5 minutes of recording at a stretch respectively. If you're shooting at 60 fps, be warned that your footage will come out looking very dark. Videos were fairly smooth and we didn't see any focus hunting even when tracking moving objects in the dark. Just like with stills, the quality of video was significantly better in the daytime than at night. The OnePlus 6T is good at what it does, but it isn't a clear-cut upgrade, not that one was even needed. If the OnePlus 6 continued to be available, we would struggle to recommend the new model over it. OnePlus has had a good run without much competition at its flagship killer price point over the last 5 years, but now it's facing heat from the Asus Zenfone 5Z and more importantly, the Poco F1. Prices have increased again with this generation but are still quite reasonable. The base model has had the steepest increase and is now priced at 37,999 rupees. We wonder why OnePlus didn't keep a 64GB storage option around. Compared to the much more expensive iPhone XS, iPhone XR, Google Pixel 3 series and Samsung Galaxy S9 series, the OnePlus 6T feels like an excellent deal. It just isn't as exciting as we're used to. That was our review of the new OnePlus 6T, and for more reviews and videos like this, do visit us at gadgets360.com.